Joined now by one of the Valley's top super angel investors, Floodgate's Mike Maples, says he passed on an opportunity to invest in Airbnb. And Mike, welcome back. Always great to have you on the show.
Thanks very much.
So you passed.
Yeah, well,
why?
Well, first of all, when you invest as early as we do, it's one of the hazards of the business that you see some spectacular opportunities, and sometimes you just don't see them at the time. And so Airbnb in particular basically was on its third idea when it really took off, or it's the third iteration of the idea. And I met Brian and the guys about a week before the Democratic National Convention, and they described it to me as a couch surfing deal, and they were going to go see if they could make something work in Denver. And I thought, these are really good guys, but it's just kind of crazy. And so it's a really tough one to pass on at the time, because I thought it had Thunder Lizard potential, but it was just so crazy at the time that we just passed, and that was clearly a mistake.
And I remember it did see kind of a surge around the DNC and then kind of fell away, but now it's come back with a vengeance. $112 million, though, that sounds like a lot.
It is. Well, so in their defense, I think that they are a potential marketplace, and marketplaces have natural monopoly characteristics. And so I think that the bet on Airbnb is, if they can get to critical mass globally, that they could have a very defensible advantage based on these network effects and that are created in marketplaces. And those network effects are very hard to replicate, because you have to have the buy side and the sell side working at the same time. So I actually am pretty bullish on them these days. I think they're very good guys, and I just wrong place at the wrong time. I wish I'd met them about 3 months later.
Hey, Mike, let me ask you about these kinds of investments, because I think we've had you on a lot talking about that you get in early, that you get in with sort of a small dollar amount for venture capital terms. But I wonder how you manage your portfolio as these companies grow. What do you think about concentration, and how much of a single company is too much in your portfolio in the early days?
Well, it's interesting, Corey. I don't really look at it like a portfolio. So my view is that the high-tech business is a business of radical exceptionalism, and a very small company, a small subset of companies end up being very valuable over time. And so when we invest, we look at it like one investment at a time, where we ask the question, could this be the next Thunder Lizard if it works out? And what we find out is, over time, if we think that way, if we try not to be too macro about it, that's the way we have the highest probability of getting into these really good companies. As far as how much is too much to own, I'm not as much of a late-stage expert as some of the guys like Mark and Ben are at Andreessen Horowitz, or some of the other folks, but I imagine they look at it similarly to how I do. I think that they look at it like there's a very small number of truly exceptional companies, and when you have a chance to get into one of those, you can never own too much. And so,
but at a certain point, when you've got a portfolio of companies, yeah, I wouldn't think you'd want any one investment to represent, I don't know, pick a number, 20%, 70% of your portfolio?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but my basic view is that a great portfolio becomes great. For example, Excel has a great portfolio in one of their recent funds because they have Facebook. And our portfolio has a chance to do really well because we have companies like Twitter and Chegg and ModCloth and folks like that. And the venture business is so different from a lot of other money management businesses in that the winners are just so massively disproportionately affecting the outcome that, generally speaking, the greater sin is to not get into the companies when you have a chance. I feel a lot worse about my decision to pass on Airbnb than any companies I invested in that went out of business or whatever exposure I had.
Speaking of social networking, you've talked about how you think the first stage of social networking is over. So what do you think of Google+?
I think they've done a really nice job so far. So obviously they've innovated in some ways that provide some distance from Facebook, allowing you to group different members and friends into different areas. I think the thing that remains to be seen is what will the engagement really be. I mean, right now it's a cause celeb in Silicon Valley, and a lot of the chattering class uses it and loves it. But the question is, are people in the middle America who have really adopted Facebook as a mainstream platform, are they going to engage and use it on a regular basis? And there are good reasons to be optimistic, but the jury's really still out.
So you're an investor in Twitter. I mean, how do you think Google+ encroaches on Twitter's territory?
I'm not too worried about that. I think that Twitter has its own value proposition and its own franchise. franchise now. I think what Twitter needs to do is just do a good job of being Twitter. They need to keep working to increase their engagement. They need to keep making Twitter easy to onboard for new users. And I think for the most part, they're doing that. I think they have the right priorities.
Mike, I'm struck by, I sort of took for granted maybe even a month ago that Facebook was that was the social networking platform. Google Plus coming on quickly. I've suddenly been running into anecdotes of people who've dropped out of Facebook, busy Facebook people. I heard a story about a priest preaching to his flock saying, I want all of you off of Facebook to focus on the people that you're actually with all day. It just struck me that there's seemingly a shift that these things aren't as permanent as it might have seemed even 6 months ago.
Well, I don't know. I often like to run the thought experiment of, if you look at all these social media companies, which ones will be around 20 years from now and known by many people as permanent brands? And I really think Facebook meets that standard. And so I think that there's some temporary issues with Google Plus, and Silicon Valley tends to get really excited about these things right as they happen. But I think Facebook has just an incredible user base, an incredible value proposition to those users. I don't see them going anywhere anytime soon. I think Google needs to be their best self and do a good job with Google Plus, but I think Facebook is firmly entrenched and going to be a long-term valuable company.
Well, that is something we are going to be continuing to monitor. Mike Maples, always great to have you here. Thanks again for joining us.